My name is Rod Diridon Sr., and you spell that Roddiridon Sr., and I'm the Executive Director of the Minetta Transportation Institute, and for many years I've been the member and past chair of the California High-Speed Rail Authority Board, and I was very proud to have been chair of ABAG in the late 1970s and chair of MTC in the late 1980s. Well, regionalism is extremely important, but has not always been important in this area. When the regional organizations were created back in the late 60s and 70s, ABAG, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Save San Francisco Bay, the Bay, BCDC, Bay Conservation Development Commission, and others, they were really created to thwart regionalism. They were really created to protect local jurisdictions' authorities and local control over one single issue, air quality or transportation. It took some real effort on the part of regionally oriented elected officials in that mid-1970s through the mid-1980s period to force a consideration of true regionalism and mixed jurisdiction regionalism. That really, the breakthrough was I think it was during my time of office, although I won't take credit for it. It really came out of the brains of Reven Tranter, who was the genius of regional government in our area. Dr. Tranter proposed, and I implemented, the JACPAC Committee, Joint Air Quality Planning Committee, which is a committee that developed the first regional master plan that included transportation, air quality, and land use. The integrated master plan. It took many years, several $1 million worth of consulting fees, and finally was adopted, that regional air quality management plan. And then the JACPAC Committee continued to exist as a coordinating point, and does continue to exist to this time as a coordinating point between MTC, the Air Quality Management District, and ABAG.
Are you familiar with the airport planning, the regional airport plan that ABAG helped put together?
Well, it occurred several years ago, and it is a continuing effort, and it is designed to look at the air transport requirements for the region and try to propose capacity to meet that requirement over the longer term. That plan is now going to have to be revised dramatically because part of the air transport requirement is going to be assumed by the high-speed rail program. The so-called short-hop airlines that had taken up and have currently take up a lot of space on our airports in terms of landing slots. Much of that traffic will move over to the high-speed rail programs because it'll be shorter period of time to get from San Francisco SFO or San Jose or Oakland to the LA airports on train, downtown to downtown, than it does now in terms of your airlines when you add in the security delays and the distance out of town of the airports. So that plan will have to be revised now to consider the impact of the high-speed train system on especially the short-hop airline landing slot requirements of our airports.
Was that one of the primary planning committees, for lack of a better word, in terms of strategically approaching the airport plan as a region, the three Bay Area airports?
Yes, I think there really was an error when we first began planning our airports back in the 30s in talking about individual cities wanting every individual city wanting their airport. San Francisco wanted theirs. San Jose created their own airport in that period of time, and Oakland. And then almost a competition between, not almost, an abject competition between the big cities trying to expand their airports to become the international connect and intercontinental airline connect in competition with the neighboring cities. Well, that caused some of the cities to do things that were not efficient, were redundant, and certainly didn't promote collegiality between the cities or environmental protection. The airports are not good environmental neighbors, both in terms of air quality but also in terms of noise. And so we've got to figure out a way to use air traffic for the right purpose and use other tools for shorter distance air travel. You know, building transportation systems is like a carpenter building a house. You have tools for certain purposes. You drive a nail with a hammer. You cut a piece of wood with a saw. You can drive a screw with a hammer, but the screw won't hold. Well, we've been driving screws with hammers in our area and in the United States now for the better part of a century. And as a result, we're falling way behind the rest of the world in terms of an integrated, sustainable transportation system. And we've got to get back to doing that. And the best way to get back to integrating our transportation devices so that we're using the right tool for the right purpose is through cooperative regional planning.
So looking at a regional approach, what projects or what things exist in the Bay Area that come to mind that both MTC and ABAG can together take credit for?
Well, I think the first air quality management plan is something that MTC, ABAG, and the Air Quality District did. It says air quality management plan, but it was primarily a land use and transportation plan. The result was air quality, but it was primarily a land use and transportation plan that came out of the joint efforts of ABAG and MTC. Another very physical example of success is the regional government building in Oakland. Until the mid-1970s, late 1970s, each one of the organizations had different headquarters. Well, MTC and ABAG were located up at the old Claremont Hotel, but it was inconvenient. We had grown out of the facility. It was expensive, and so we were able to reduce the cost of our annual rent by moving into a more centrally located area right on top of a BART station in downtown Oakland by creating the joint committee. I created it. I was the chair of the board of ABAG when we created it, and I was very proud to have appointed Joe Bort, who was the grand old supervisor from Alameda County, to chair that committee. And Joe hammered heads and brought people together and got that building built, and has been a great asset to the region. The environmental management plan was created by ABAG with input from MTC. Those plans, which are now federally required, were the first in the nation when they were created here in the Bay Area, and have been guidelines for the improvement of air quality, environmental conditions generally, reduction of congestion, the integration of our transportation systems so that we have buses meeting trains instead of vice versa, instead of the neglect of those interconnects, time transfer opportunity. So that interrelationship has been phenomenally important. Now, I have to tell you that I created the ire of some of our good friends in the region when in 1992, when I was chair of MTC, and then on into 1992, I created what was called Bay Vision 2020. It was an attempt of using a private commission chaired by the Chancellor of University of California and with the top leaders of various organizations throughout the region, the chair of BCDC, the chair of the Bay Area Council and others, on a 30-member commission that worked for 3 years to try to put together legislation that would merge, in effect, merge MTC, ABAG, and the Air Quality Management District. That's the situation in many other areas where you have one regional government instead of multiple. Well, we couldn't do it. Ultimately, there was so much inertia on the part of local government, especially the smaller cities, that were afraid of being imposed upon by the big jurisdictions, that we couldn't get the legislation adopted that would cause a real merger. So they strengthened the JACPAC committee and caused more committee cooperation, but retained the 3 different agencies as completely separate agencies. That was too bad. We still need to consider that kind of a merger at some point in the future so that we have direct integration of those very important functions, air quality, transportation, and land use. The first air quality plan was begun in the 1970s, and latter part of the 1970s, and it was guided by the JACPAC committee, Joint Air Quality Planning Committee, and I believe it was approved and then reapproved and modified, and continues to be modified periodically with amendments. The first time it was approved was around 1980.
The Bay Area is so much more at an advantage because of its sort of one voice philosophy. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that's an odd thing because SCAG in Southern California, which is a multi-jurisdictional regional government, somewhat like ABAG but broader, has the ability to talk with one voice more effectively than we do. But they have so many jurisdictions within SCAG that they can't come to a consensus on anything that's at all controversial. On the other hand, we have 4 different primary regional governments: MTC, ABAG, the Air Quality Management District, and the BCDC. And those 4 agencies work so well together that they're able to develop joint policy positions even though they're not merged. So at some point they need to be merged. There does need to be even closer cooperation and closer integration of those important issues. But they are making it work by virtue of cooperation.
I'm wondering if perhaps that comment wasn't more directed towards MTC and state and federal funding.
Well, the hammer in the process, because as you know, ABAG is a voluntary organization. The Air Quality Management District has very distinct powers and has used those powers effectively to clean up the air in our region wonderfully, sometimes controversially, but wonderfully. The real hammer in this process is the ability of MTC to guide funds. Now, it used to be that was voluntary, but in 1991, the federal government adopted under Chairman, at that time, Chairman Norm Minetta's leadership of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, they created the ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, which codified MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations. MTC is our Metropolitan Planning Organizations, as a device through which federal funding would come, federal transportation funding would come. And if you wanted federal funding, you had to go through your MPO. You couldn't go directly back to Washington and expect to get a grant. You had to go to your MPO, make sure that the grant fits within the MPO's master plan, and then the MPO needed to endorse your grant. We've been very successful in this region in getting much more than our share of the federal funding available for transportation because we have a good master plan and because we have a very good advocacy capacity coming out of MTC. Steve Heminger, who, when I was at MTC, Larry Doms was the executive director, and Larry was a grand gentleman. He was the head of the MPO programs in Washington, just a phenomenal person. But he nurtured up Steve Heminger. Steve was the director of the legislative committee, legislative advocacy committee, both in Washington and in Sacramento, and now is the executive director of MTC. And Steve is respected throughout the United States. In fact, he was vice chair of the committee, the commission that was created by the President and Congress to look at the financing situation for the whole United States. And Steve was the real leader in that commission and brought his knowledge of real practical life transportation requirements to that commission. And as a result, was one of the final candidates for Secretary of Transportation in the recent selection of the Secretary of Transportation under President Obama.
Where do you think regionalism is headed in the Bay Area?
I don't know where it's headed, because that's an amorphous process that becomes more tenuous the more serious our fiscal situations become. Because the first place that you want to cut is anywhere but your own local city. And that means that money going to the regional governments that oftentimes flows through cities is going to be reduced and reduced and reduced because the city's budgets and the county budgets can't afford it. So right now I think regionalism is at a crisis because of the reduced funding coming from the state and federal level and from the local level. And that should not be the case, because we have to be more concerned about the region. As we grow together as a megalopolis and our city and county boundaries disappear because they're just not definable anymore, we have to be more concerned about things like commuter sheds, where people are commuting from and to, instead of what cities and counties they're commuting through. We have to be more concerned about air basins. What area is covered by the air pollution created by a commuter shed? And that may not even be the 9-county region. It is now expanding beyond the 9-county region. So different issues now have to be considered, and they don't relate to cities and counties anymore. Now, cities and counties are obsolete. We still have to have police and fire and other kinds of services. But when we talk about transportation, regional transportation and air quality and economic vitality, those things really are regional and maybe super regional compared to what we've been thinking about in the past, and have to be addressed differently than we've addressed these issues in the past.
So if you look at the past 50 years for ABAG or the past 40 years for MTC, what are some of the major accomplishments that each agency can be proud of?
Well, I think probably the most important success has been the integrated regional air quality management plan, because that drives not only air quality planning, but also transportation planning and land use planning. And that plan really needs to be expanded now so that it subsumes within it the master plan for transportation and the master plan for land use. Of course, our master plan for land use is voluntary because the cities and counties won't give up their land use control. But ABAG has done a valiant job at attempting to do a master planning job for land use and especially housing. Everybody wants industry because it creates tax base. Nobody wants housing when they're building. Well, we've got to have an integration of housing and land use so that you do what we used to say, you house your jobs. Well, many of our cities have a huge deficit in terms of jobs and housing, or it's called jobs housing imbalance, where you have a lot of jobs and no housing. Well, cities like Palo Alto, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara have a huge number of jobs because industry in Silicon Valley has settled in those areas, while San Jose has much more housing than they have jobs, and as a result they don't have the tax base that the jobs, the industry would have brought to their area, and they're having to pay for the cost of the housing, and housing doesn't pay enough taxes to pay for the services. So we have to figure out a way to balance that jobs housing program, and the best way to do that is to give ABAG some more authority in terms of the development of their land use master plans, so that you integrate the jobs and housing a little more effectively, or figure out a tax sharing system of some type, so that the very tax base rich communities assist the tax base poor communities in providing service to their residents. That's especially true now and when we're in such a dire financial situation throughout the United States. Well, you know, I just mentioned the accomplishments of the regional governments as it relates to the environmental quality plan, and I think that's as much an MTC success as it was an ABAG or an Air Quality Management Board success, because an element of that plan was the first, and it wasn't a very comprehensive one at first, but it was the first regional transportation master plan. Now that's grown and become separate from the Air Quality Management Plan, the regional transportation master plan, but it really needs to be integrated pretty carefully into the Air Quality Management Plan, because there is a direct integration, there is a direct relationship between land use, air quality, and transportation. You know, quality of life, you hear those buzzwords over and over again, are impacted most, I think, by transportation. The amount of time that a breadwinner, he or she, spends commuting has a direct impact on their ability to do work when they get to work, or their ability to love their family and share with their family when they get home. The ability to get product to the marketplace is affected by transportation. If you can't get the product to the marketplace, you don't have a job, or you can't buy it. Now, we have situations now as we grow, and we've gone through a downturn in the Bay Area in the United States, but Silicon Valley is coming back now like gangbusters. And we've got people, tens of thousands of people every day that commute into Silicon Valley for jobs from Tracy, from Fresno, far away as Bakersfield, driving on terribly dangerous roads, Highway 152, which two-lane road in some places, burning $3 to $4 a gallon gasoline, causing serious pollution in that stop-start traffic, taking 2.5 hours for that commute one way. And you know, they come to work, they get to work, and they're tired and they're frustrated. They get home at night and they're ready to kick the kids instead of hug them. We've got to work that out. That's one of the things that high-speed rail would do, of course, to bring those people from Fresno to Silicon Valley in 51 minutes instead of 2.5 hours, rested and ready for a day's work. That's a great step forward for high-speed rail. High-speed rail is just one tool, though, in that carpenter's toolkit of tools. And if we don't have then the distribution system in Silicon Valley and throughout the Bay Area with BART and Caltrain and Altamont Express and ACE and the bus systems and our bike lanes and all of the rest of the things that, you know, if you have to drive a car, make sure it's an electric car. But all those things that make an integrated transportation system have to be put together now during a time when money's tight in order for our economy to thrive and our people to be healthy.
Talk a little bit about the Bay Area's appreciation of open space and the natural beauty that we have.
That's really personal to me. I got into politics originally as one of the co-chairs of the Parks Charter measure in Santa Clara County, which sequestered a portion of the property tax and said that it could only be spent for parks. Pardon me. That Parks Charter measure was adopted and then readopted, has been readopted now by 6 times through the history, so that it continues to protect a portion of the county's money for only use in parks. And during my time on the County Board of Supervisors, I was very proud to have been the parks liaison most of the time. And the parks property went from about 500 acres to 45,000 acres during my 20 years. In fact, 43,000 acres. It's up to 45,000 acres now. And that's a wonderful legacy. At the same time that was happening, other folks were working very hard on the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District and the East Bay Open Space District, and now the South County Open Space District, and so you have additional districts that are working on protecting land. And the idea there, by the way, wasn't just to go out and buy land. It was to buy land directly adjacent to the populated area so that you stopped urban sprawl. If you bought parkland adjacent to your developed land, then you couldn't extend services through the parkland. So you couldn't have police and fire and sewers and electricity and the other kinds of things extended through the park to get beyond the park to create urban sprawl. And that's worked pretty well. It hasn't worked perfectly by any means, but it's worked pretty darn well to protect some of our hillsides. I was the Santa Clara County chair of the Save the Bay Association from the late 1970s until I left office. And I was on the board with the 3 grand ladies, Kay Kerr and her 3 stalwarts who started the Save the Bay Association, and have a great affection for the Bay. I realize that bay not only in fact is our is our air conditioning system and is our device for creating food for much of the area. But it is a symbol. It's a symbol that tells us that if we're careful of it, then it will nurture us in return. And that attitude can be applied to all of the natural spaces around it. The bay is very visible because it was being filled in very rapidly. Something like 60% of what had been the first bay that was first seen by our Native Americans is gone now, filled in by dirt. Well, we've stopped that, and we're saving what's left. But the same concept can be applied to our hillside lands and our streamside areas, which are now being protected, and we're developing trails for people to relate to them, and other natural resources. And if we don't do that, there's going to be nothing left for our kids in the future. Let me get macro. I speak around the world now. I guess when you get old enough, you get discovered, and I've been a sustainability speaker in at least well over a dozen countries in the last 5 or 6 years. Primarily on high-speed rail, but other issues too, relating to transportation primarily. And I just have to share with the folks that are here today that we've fallen way behind the rest of the world. The United States, the only place the United States now competes effectively with the rest of the world is in our freight rail systems. We still have the best freight rail system in the world. Everything else, we're second class. Our mass transportation systems are not nearly as modern as those in Asia or in Europe. Our highway systems are falling into disrepair, and they're helter-skelter. They were just kind of laid down as part of a frantic desire to build highways. Well, some of them don't make sense. None of them are being maintained properly. And there's not enough money in the Highway Trust Fund anymore to maintain them or to complete them, because the Highway Trust Fund isn't creating the funds anymore because we're using economical cars and we're not getting the gallonage tax anymore. So we've got to realize that we've got to become a better member of the world community. This was brought home to me when I gave a speech to the Asia Rail Congress in Hong Kong 4 years ago. The Pacific Rim ministers of transportation were there. I gave a good talk and told them about how important sustainability was and some of the ideas. At the end, the Minister of Transportation from Pakistan stood up, looked me in the eye and said, "How dare you come here and talk to us about sustainable transportation when the United States is 4% of the world's population, creating almost 30% of the greenhouse gases causing global warming?" He's right on. He's got the numbers exact, and it's getting worse. The only reason why it's getting worse is because China's becoming such a polluter that we're falling a bit behind them now. But we're not reducing our pollution, and we've got to do that. We've got to become a world citizen. We're behind the rest of the world in virtually every mode of transportation now, except for freight railroads, and we're still the best in terms of freight railroads. But every one of the other modes of transportation, we're second rate. We've got to figure out a way to pull it back together, create the funding, and pull it back together with good regional planning like MTC, ABAG have done in the past to create an integrated transportation system that will take us through this 21st century.